You are listening to the Visualizing War and Peace podcast. With the help of a wide range of guests, we examine how war and peace are experienced in different periods and places, and we discuss the world-building impact which representations of conflict and its aftermath can have on us as individuals and societies. Hello, I'm Zofia Guertin, a doctoral student in Classics and Ancient History at the University of St. Andrews. Over the past few years, I've been working behind the scenes on the Visualizing War and Peace podcast as a sound editor and mixer. Today, I'm stepping in as host, and I'm delighted to welcome back Dr. Alice König, director and host of the Visualizing War and Peace podcast, for part 2 of our discussion about her work and the exciting next steps in establishing the Ancient Peace Studies Network. As part of her research on ancient conflict narratives, Alice has developed a keen interest in how war's aftermath, conflict resolution, peace building, and peace itself were understood and experienced across different cultures in antiquity. Through the Ancient Peace Studies Network, she is leading new research in this area, and today we'll be exploring that work in more detail. We'll also discuss how ancient peace studies can engage with modern peace studies, and perhaps even contribute to contemporary peace literacy. In part 1 of our discussion, we explored the origins of the Visualizing War and Peace project, as well as Alice's upcoming co-edited publication with Alice König. She gave us valuable insights into how narratives of war and peace functioned in antiquity, and how we can identify peace storytelling in ancient Greek and Roman texts, and how intertextuality, both visual and textual, helps shape the world by creating a feedback loop between narrative and reality. If you haven't yet listened to this episode, I highly recommend starting there before diving into today's conversation. So we welcome you today. Alice, welcome back to your podcast.
Thank you very much, Sophia. It's great to be back.
So last time we ended on a really interesting note of looking forward and seeing where the next stages of your project were going to go. But again, I think it'd be really interesting for this discussion to ground us back at the beginning. When you and Nicholas first set up this research in 2017, it was focused on just visualizing war, which I recall it was a really interesting project you guys were doing, and it had lots of interesting facets that you were connecting across disciplines. What led you to expanding it to become Visualizing War and Peace?
Thanks, Sophia. So when we set up the Visualizing War project in 2017, as you say, but actually, if we were being honest about that, we probably ought to have called it the Visualizing Battle project, because our initial focus was very much on battle, and we were led absolutely by our ancient sources on that. Battle, war fighting are recurring themes in so many ancient texts and so many ancient material cultural artifacts, and also so much modern scholarship on antiquity. And I came from the perspective of studying ancient military manuals, training manuals, theoretical manuals, thinking through war fighting itself and generalship and strategic leadership and tactics. And Nicholas Guertin came from studying Polybius and other Greek historiography. Again, texts which pushed us towards very much a focus on battle. But as we looked more into habits of depicting, visualizing, understanding war fighting and battle, our interest grew in how war was experienced more broadly than that. And I got particularly interested in how it was experienced away from the battlefield, in homes with missing fathers or husbands or sons, in places where food was scarce as a result of war, and so on. And that really led me to a deeper interest in war's wider impacts and war's long-lasting aftermath. And that was compounded by a frustration that many of our ancient sources, and indeed our modern stories, really stop short of exploring or narrating that. So Virgil's Aeneid, for example, ends with the death of Turnus, literally Aeneas stabbing him and him dying. Silius's epic poem, The Punica, ends with the Roman general Scipio's triumphal return to Rome after his defeat of Hannibal and capture of Carthage. In history writing, in ancient Greek and Roman history writing, the resolution of one war is often followed quite rapidly by a change of focus to a new episode, or indeed to another war, rather than lots of time spent exploring decades of post-conflict transformation or post-conflict recovery. There really isn't very much digging deep into what happens in the wake of armed violence, and particularly into the ways in which ordinary people try to mitigate conflict or adapt to its impacts, or rebuild following displacement or injury or the loss of loved ones, or so on. And as I mentioned, I think in our previous podcast chat, when our ancient sources and modern studies do discuss peace and peace building, they do so from a really narrow range of perspectives. So the best known narratives and representations of peace or peace building that survive from antiquity have really centered around very top down, highly militarized macro political conceptions of conflict resolution and transition. So they focused, for example, on the conquest or subjugation of one nation or leader by another, on celebrations of victory that then parade the defeat of your foes, or the establishment of political treaties or alliances or friendships between states and ruling powers, or indeed the triumphant return of celebrated warriors to welcoming homes in everlasting glory, or their burial and memorialization and commemoration that way. So the focus has been very political, very militarizing, and very elite and very male. And our scholarship has tended to perpetuate those storytelling habits from our sources, both in paying far less attention to peace than war and in homing in on those discourses of peace that are most visible in our sources, which do identify peace building above all as securitization, as taking place almost exclusively in high politics, and as I say, as the work of a sort of privileged male elite. So we don't see that much in our ancient sources or in modern analysis of classical antiquity of the long-term intergenerational impacts of war's aftermath on ordinary people, local communities, personal struggles, maybe with finances, with housing, with health, with relationships, the day-to-day work that civilians must have undertaken just to find pockets of peace in the midst of a long siege. You know, the siege of Troy was supposedly 10 years long. All the challenges that victims of wartime rape faced in patriarchal societies, the adaptations that people displaced by conflict would have had to make, or indeed the absence of anything amounting to peace for people who were enslaved during conflict. Now, that's not to say that none of these manifestations of peace searching or peacemaking were present in antiquity. They must have been, but they were not part of the dominant discourses of peace building that gained traction then, and they've remained marginalized in our analysis ever since. But if we do write our history of ancient peace and peace building based only on the narratives and the imaginaries that were dominant, then we're writing a really limited history of peace and peace building. And we could be exploring a much more diverse history of how peace was envisioned and sought and made by ordinary people in bottom-up ways. So really, that's the impetus, that's the motivation for my new strand of work in expanding the focus of the Visualising War project to examine ancient understandings and experiences of peace and peace building. I really want to change that imbalance in our current ancient studies and indeed in our ancient sources, so that we can really start excavating and reconstructing a more holistic, more representative picture of ancient peace and peace building.
Absolutely. That's a really interesting perspective to take, and it rings incredibly true. Like whenever you see the calls for papers, calls for conferences, and I'm so much more cognizant of it now, having listened to all of your interviews, obviously. And it's always like battle narratives and battle strategy. And you can see some people broadening it out depending on what the audience is or what the focus is of the research. And as well, like if you go into mainstream bookshops and things like that, there's battle section as opposed to, any other kind of way into the material. It's interesting as well as when you're describing that, the way these things are depicted in antiquity and carried on. The part of peace for the loser is the acquiescence and then showing their submission. But there is no focus in the text or in images about the negotiations that happen in that space following, even a few months after war has been concluded. It's those years that follow, probably grinding years of rebuilding and figuring out what your identity is, particularly in antiquity, when you might have a legion or a garrison, or people might be retired from their military careers in an area they have subjugated. So that is such a complicated relationship. It would be so interesting to get stories about how that worked and how did they manage to maybe become an even more powerful political entity in the years following.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a huge gap in how we imagine, how we reconstruct, how we visualize ancient experiences of both conflict and peace. And as you say, we do get these glimpses in, let's say, Livy's History of Rome, of moments where one town near very early Rome was taken over and the people of that town were submerged into Rome and became Romans. And then the narrative moves swiftly on. But what was it like for some of the people who didn't want to become Roman, as it were, who resisted that, who protested that even perhaps, who really struggled with their sense of identity or with that sort of takeover of identity? There are all these little stories that we have glimpses of, but our sources and our modern studies do not explore. And that's the kind of history I want to excavate next.
Absolutely. So, in keeping with discussing new ways that academics can approach this material, you have recently established the first ever Ancient Peace Studies Network, which is really exciting. And I just want to know, what do you hope to achieve with this?
Thanks. So, as you've already alluded to, ancient military studies is a very huge and very influential field. And one of the goals of establishing an ancient peace studies network is actually to establish ancient peace studies as a discrete and important field of study in its own right, not just a subsection of ancient military studies. I mean, as we've said, our study of antiquity is really dominated by warfare, not only because there was an awful lot of war fighting in the ancient world, but because war is omnipresent in so many different forms of ancient storytelling, verbal and visual, and then becomes very much part of ancient and modern imaginaries of antiquity. Now, that recurring theme, that recurring focus and emphasis on war in our ancient sources, of course, has generated, as we've said, a vast field of ancient military studies, vast numbers of conferences, vast numbers of books. But it also, beyond that, the shadow of war has really influenced the kinds of questions that we ask about many wider aspects of ancient politics, society, and culture. So our historic interest in conquerors, for example, has muffled some of the questions that we might otherwise have asked about the people they enslaved. Or our awareness of long-running conflicts between Greek states, for example, has maybe led us to overemphasize the combative dynamics of their cultural self-fashioning and their expressions of cultural identity. That's not to say there weren't combative dynamics, but we've really kind of homed in on that. And of course, it's led us to explore peace primarily in relation to war, not in its own right. So whether we realize it or not, and whether we're actually studying war itself or not, we tend to approach a lot of antiquity through the lens of war a lot of the time. So one aim of the network is actually to push us beyond that, and in the process really to accelerate a much needed demilitarization of ancient world scholarship. We've talked in recent years very much about the need to decolonize ancient world scholarship, ancient world studies, but we haven't really talked about the need perhaps to demilitarize it. And I think we talked in our last podcast about how militarizing not only our ancient sources, but our modern study of those ancient sources can be. For far too long, battle and soldiering have been front and centre in ancient socio-political history, and that in turn has fed into wider popular as well as scholarly habits of admiring warfare, contributing, of course, to everyday militarisms. And, it really is the case that how we as researchers study ancient history affects how it gets taught in schools, how it gets presented in documentaries, in popular history books, then in fiction and in films and in gaming. So there are real world repercussions of this. So it's important to be really self-conscious of that, to question some of the habits that we've got into. And I hope that that's going to be one of the side effects of the Ancient Peace Studies Network. But, in a nutshell, in establishing this network, I not only want to carve out more space for peace research, including peace research decoupled from war, I also actually want to change ancient military studies so that we ask different questions about ancient warfare. And more generally, I want to shift our engagement with antiquity broadly from a recurring fascination with armed conflict to wider understandings of one particular phenomenon that we all need to invest much more time and much more resource into today, and that is understanding what peace has meant to different people in different contexts, what the absence of peace has looked and felt like, how peace has been built at personal, local, national and global levels. John Gittings, a great peace scholar, argues very persuasively we need to regard peace, not war, as the glorious art which demands our attention. And really, how we understand and build peace is one of the most urgent questions of our time, today as urgent as ever. So really, it's about putting peace studies front and centre, hopefully with the added benefits of changing how we study ancient warfare and changing how we study antiquity in general.
And it sounds excellent. And what aspects of peace and peace building will the network look at, though?
So I've had several colleagues trying to get me to define what I mean by peace or what I mean by peace building. Are you talking about conflict resolution? Are you going to include inner and personal peace as well as political peace? And I don't think it's for me to determine what aspects of peace or peace building our network's going to look at. I think that rather than trying to impose our definitions of peace or our sort of blinkered visions of peace on antiquity, I really want us to let our ancient sources guide us, but also to look at a much wider range of sources than we've tended to explore up to now, and where necessary to read against the grain of some of our very elite, very militarizing sources. So the network will be looking at lots and lots of different representations and expressions of peace in antiquity, really to explore diversity or to foreground and amplify the diversity of representations and expressions. So we will be looking, for example, at concepts of inner peace in, let's say, Greek philosophy, ideas about how you acquire or achieve peace of mind, ideas that we can find, for example, in theories of Epicureanism, where peace of mind comes from an absence of fear or absence of fear of the gods, for instance. We're going to be looking at the everyday philosophy, as it were, that's visible in fragments of poetry or fragments of song. So I'm thinking, for instance, of a fragment by the Greek poet and playwright Philemon, where he talks about peace as the kindliest goddess, the bestower of every treasure, of weddings, kindred, children, friends, wealth, health, wine, and pleasure. And that's, a little snapshot of a really interesting image of positive peace that I think probably resonates with many of us today. This idea that inner peace, personal peace is something that we achieve when we are socializing with people we love, when we're eating good food, when we're healthy and feeling well. We'll look at Roman concepts of leisure, otium, that are visible, for instance, in Pliny the Younger's letters, or in Horace's poetry or Catullus' poetry, bearing in mind, of course, that those are really privileged, elite concepts. So one of the things that we'll then be exploring is the concept of otium and the personal leisure and peaceful activities conceptualized primarily as only an elite endeavor, something that elite people can access. We'll look at negative conceptions of peace as well, ideas that we can see, for example, in historians Sallust and Livy, who hint that at times of peace can bring a real decline in moral values, in behaviors, and then lead actually to internal discord and strife and political ambition, which ultimately brings about civil war, for instance. We'll look at early Christian theorizing and other conceptions shaped by religious belief or practice. So Augustine might come in there. Marcus Aurelius, who of course was a very war-fighty emperor. And then peace deities, or indeed representations of divine peace building. So the depictions that we have of Olympian gods doing conflict resolution, digging into the assumptions that underlie those scenes, those representations. Or the image that we get towards the start of Lucretius's On the Nature of Things, his philosophical poem that explores Epicurean thought, where he asks Venus to seduce Mars and bring at least a temporary peace to the world so that his primary addressee is able to focus on Epicurean thought rather than being distracted by politics. And that image of Venus seducing Mars gets us thinking about gendered ideas of peace. So the peace building roles that different sources give to women, the mediation of the matrons in the Coriolanus episode in Roman history, for instance, or images that we get in Plutarch's On the Bravery of women brokering peace. Lots of exploration of what civil harmony or indeed civil crisis and discord look like in different parts of antiquity, how civil harmony gets achieved as well as threatened. So civil harmony being contingent on the development of justice processes and strong laws, for example, or particular kinds of political governance, as well as social morals and all the way through that to much more political concepts and representations of peace. So the kinds of conceptualizations that are visible in peace treaties, where ideas of brotherhood, friendship are referenced, for instance, in the Treaty of Kadesh, historiographic narratives of conflict resolution, which are all about stability and alliances and agreements and pacts of non-aggression and indeed taxation and quite extractive ideas of peace building. And then narratives of violent victory with peace as the spoils of war and representations on triumphal monuments and so on. So everything from these glimpses that we get of people trying to achieve inner personal peace all the way through to macro political representations. And as I say, the aim really is to explore the diversity of peace imaginaries across antiquity and in different parts of antiquity, in different contexts in antiquity, to identify also which concepts and discourses particularly dominated in which contexts and why. Ultimately, one of the things that this hopefully will result in is a new book, a compendium called New Visions of Ancient Peace, which will be co-authored by members of the Ancient Peace Studies Network. And the idea is to offer around 100 critical analyses of different manifestations or articulations of peace and peace building from a range of contexts and communities across antiquity, covering the whole spectrum from personal peace to sort of conflict resolution, conflict prevention even. So, well-known visions as we see on propagandistic coins, but also discussions of conflict resolution in Greek symposium settings, or funerary art that illuminate aspects of post-conflict recovery, or migration statistics, really amplifying unheard voices and marginalized imaginaries, and putting everyday lives alongside the geopolitical discourses as well. So, as I say, the goal is really not just to explore diversity, but to foreground some of the voices and experiences and conceptualizations that have not been at the forefront of our study of ancient peace and peace building to date.
Yeah, absolutely. It sounds so encompassing, like you really touch on every aspect of ancient society, and it'll be really interesting in particular to see how much something like this could potentially shape just even how you would lay out a department. Maybe I'm speaking too soon, but just from how you describe it, I can just envision like 10 different courses right there. And it's such an interesting launching point to just pivot and just see the world from a different perspective. And it offers a lot of like really interesting questions you can ask. And then you've just gone through so many possible areas of exploration. So this will be really fascinating to see. And I'm sure it will spur on a lot of people because, as you were mentioning, just the different philosophical approaches and just finding a way to experience peace in the moment. Like people are struggling with that now. There is a war for our attention, if I may use militaristic terms. And we are battling finding our own inner peace as we speak, and across social media, across this influx of news, and just living in a society where we are required to pay so much attention all the time to different things. There's just so much really interesting scope for bringing people into this research that you've got who wouldn't necessarily be people who would study ancient history, perhaps, because it's such a broader tent, I think, is what you're offering.
Yeah, absolutely. I've got a couple of fantastic students at the moment who are doing something called applied classics, where they're exploring the application of ancient material to address modern problems. And the problem they've chosen to address is mental well-being. And they really are interested in contextualizing ancient approaches to addressing lack of inner peace in ways that then might provide interesting food for thought in the modern world. And of course, we're recording this at a time when our newsreel, the search for peace in Ukraine, is giving all of us anything but inner peace at home, because it's on a knife edge. It's looking desperately like it might all be going in the wrong direction. What we're looking at the moment is the way in which, in the modern world, some very top-down, very belligerent discourses of peace and peace building are being imposed by certain powers on peace processes that might result in a very extractive, very damaging kind of peace process, if we're even getting close to a peace process at this point. So we can see in the real world the way in which how we talk about, how we think about, how we visualize peace and peace building and war as well are, having massive ramifications at the macro political level, at the geopolitical level, but also having massive ramifications at the personal level for each of us individually as we worry about the state of affairs in the world and people we love. And I think one of the questions I really want to ask is the extent to which in antiquity discourses of inner peace were ever connected to discourses of interpersonal and political peace. And that's a question I don't have the answer to yet, but it is a question that modern peace studies is asking a lot, and a question that I think is one of the many that we might probe as we go forward with our work.
Awesome. That sounds great. And as with your research on visualizing war, you're interested in peace storytelling, and that comes up a lot, in particular in why some habits of imagining and representing peace and peace building become dominant in the culture that constructs it, and why others didn't. So what kind of stories do we commonly find people telling about peace and peace building in antiquity, and whose experiences would you say that they are reflecting or representative of?
Yeah, that's a really important question for us to bear in mind as we study our ancient sources, always asking about the positionality of the conceptualizations or representations of peace that we're analysing. As I've said, we're interested in a diversity of understandings and experiences, but of course a very narrow range of ideas actually dominated. And by and large, those ideas are the ideas of those people who had power and privilege. And in fact, one of the things that we see in ancient discourses of peace and peace building is that peace is conceptualized as a privilege which those with power can choose to bestow. So, for instance, there's a 3rd or 4th century CE Greek novel by Heliodorus called the Ethiopica. And in that, there's a little moment, it's a sort of rollicking narrative that follows characters who are having extraordinary adventures all around the ancient Mediterranean world. But in that, we get this glimpse of a kind of discourse of peace, or a peace imaginary, that's quite common elsewhere in antiquity. The idea that peace is something that a victor can deal out if he chooses instead of death, but something that involves the defeated giving up freedoms and giving up territory and so on. So we've got Persians, for instance, being talked to about the peace that an Ethiopian king can bestow on them. And they're told at this time, your king knows how to overcome his enemies. And it's also in his nature, he's inclined to grant mercy to people who humbly ask for it. And it sort of celebrates his compassionate spirit. And it talks about, this is sort of quotation within the text, although he holds your lives in his hand to grant or take away, now, since you've humbled yourselves, he delivers you from the known and certain penalty of defeat and allows you to decide at your own pleasure what terms of peace you would like. So that all sounds lovely and merciful and very beneficent and so on. But it turns out that the people of Syene, in their answer, say, well, they commit themselves, their children and their wives to this king, to do with them as he thinks good. And if they might live, they'll render up their city also, which is now in a desperate case and utterly ruined. And they're going to surrender their army and make all sorts of concessions. Mm-hmm. So the conceptualization of peace and peace building there is, as I say, very much that peace is this privilege that a powerful person can grant. And we see this in other texts as well. So in the sort of early 2nd century CE, we see this in Pliny's Panegyricus, Pliny's speech in praise of the Emperor Trajan. He talks about the fact that Trajan has conquered vast places. The people he's conquered have terror in their midst. Our enemies are afraid. They crave permission to obey Roman commands. They see that Rome has a leader who ranks with her heroes of old, who has a title of emperor that's been achieved through seas stained with the bloodshed of victory, on battlefields piled high with the bodies of the dead. So incredibly brutal militaristic imagery. And the peace that the Romans have achieved as a result of this, Pliny articulates as, today, therefore, we are receiving hostages, not paying for them. Huge losses and vast sums of money are no longer needed to buy terms of peace, which shall name us as the conquerors. The prayers and entreaties on the other side are for us to grant or refuse at will. They show their gratitude when we will listen, but if we are deaf to their pleas, they dare not complain. And again, that's that incredibly imbalanced conceptualization of peace, not as a negotiation between parties, but as something which the successful general, the successful power, the successful state is able to grant or refuse at their will. And all that's left for the defeated people is to show their gratitude, or not complain, at least. So that's one dominant conceptualization of peace. I've just given you, a Greek and a Roman source from very different genres that give us an insight into that. I suppose the other quite dominant habit of visualizing peace that I'd like to bring out is this idea that peace is fragile and temporary and even unnatural. When peace treaties from antiquity are negotiated, usually they're negotiating actually security and stability for a short period of time, right? There's an end point. There's a sort of number of years or a number of decades where an agreement is due to last, and certain concessions are going to be made on different sides depending on who's negotiating with whom. So ancient peace treaties have built into them quite often a sense that this is a temporary solution, a short period of stability and securitization for the benefit of both sides. If we go right back to Homer's Iliad and book 18 of that, there's a moment where Achilles needs to be given new armor because the armor that he had been worn by Patroclus in battle and then was seized by Hector as a trophy. So Achilles' mother, the sea nymph Thetis, asks the god Hephaestus to forge some new weapons for her son. And amongst the armour that's forged is a very elaborately decorated shield, and Homer gives a very long description of this. It's got 5 layers to it, concentric circles and so on. And in one of the layers we see that there are these 2 cities depicted, 2 fair cities of mortal men. And in one city there were marriages and feastings, and by the light of the blazing torches they were leading the brides from their rooms through the city, and nice bridal song and marriages, and men were whirling in the dance, and there's music, and we see images of farming in vineyards, but also In the other city, we see strife. We see people gathered in a place of assembly because strife has arisen. There are people fighting over a murder, over a killing at least. And in this other city, we see two armies of warriors gleaming in their armor. And Homer actually says, among them strife and tumult joined and destructive fate. And we get this one glimpse of temporary peace, the kind of vision that we saw in that a fragment of Philemon, feasting, wealth, health, kindred, and so on. But alongside that is always strife and bloodshed threatening to take over. One of the things that Achilles' shield depicts, it's a weapon, it's a protective weapon, but it's still a weapon. So in itself, it's a paradoxical piece of equipment. It's meant to preserve life, but it's also only ever used in battle. But on it depicted is not just pockets of peace, but the fragility of peace, because that peace is constantly framed by the threat of strife and bloody conflict. And that takes me to another Greek philosopher, Heraclitus, who theorized about strife as being a very powerful force in the world. He talks about the fact that we must recognize that war is common, strife is justice, or strife brings justice. All things happen according to strife and necessity. And Heraclitus actually says war is the father and king of all. And war makes gods of men, but he also makes slaves of men. So war is this productive, dominant force. Strife kind of rules and structures the world. And peace is often conceived then as a sort of temporary relief from war. It might be merciful, but it's temporary. But it's also about conquest and it's about extraction. It might be beautiful and happy, but it's kind of abnormal. It's not the natural state of affairs. And I guess if those are the dominant war imaginaries, then one of the questions we next need to ask is what behaviors or what consequences flow from those mindsets. And that brings us back to this idea of the sort of the feedback loop between narrative and reality that we talked about in the last podcast. The stories that we tell, the imaginaries that we have, don't just reflect a reality, they help to shape it because they do influence how we think and how we feel and behave. So if we constantly understand peace and peace building as extractive and a zero-sum game where some people win and some people lose, and peace is something that's a cessation of war rather than a sustainable state, then that affects how we go about building it, how we go about keeping it, how we go about fostering it for the future.
That's fascinating, Alice. And I think it gives listeners and myself a lot to just even chew on right now, because all I could think of was, I just saw this unfold this week on the news. In the last 5 days, we've had an event at the White House where President Zelensky was brought in, and not necessarily the most powerful leader involved in the conflict, but a very powerful leader is dictating how the victim in this scenario is going to embrace peace, how they need to understand what their peace is going to be, and that they should be grateful and smile. Mm-hmm. And watching those events unfold, it sort of matched the description you read out too, how it's laid out. I'm sure other people listening will get those shocks in their real world and their own experiences as you read out these quotes from antiquity. And it's just so crazy to see how something written thousands of years ago can viscerally elicit an experience of this moment where peace is being thrown around, and it's being thrown around with, in my perspective, a sense of injustice. So this is really interesting.
Yeah, and the fact that there are narratives abounding throughout antiquity and since, which have normalized the idea that peace is a gift which powerful people can bestow, and which those less powerful, as you say, have to be grateful for, mm-hmm. and have to accept on whatever terms. The quotation I gave you was from a Greek novel. It's a work of fiction. It's fantastical. Mm-hmm. But this isn't just a work of fiction. As you say, this is a terrible reality that is affecting millions of real people's lives right now and for the future. And the conversations that you allude to in the White House between Trump and Zelensky and Vance, J.D. Vance, the vice president of the US, those conversations not only have these horrible echoes with the sort of ancient material I've been talking about, they will have resonances to come because they're broadcast all around the world. And what we've just seen is some very powerful storytelling about how world leaders conceptualize and kind of cement ideas and approaches to peace building right there. So it's, again, not an inert story. It's a story that will have repercussions to come. And it's a story that President Zelensky is now fighting really hard to overcome and to push back against. President Trump actually said, I'm glad everyone's watching this unfold. He knew the power of the storytelling that was going on there and how that storytelling was further empowering him potentially. This really just drives home the power of these peace imaginaries, these stories, the discourses that we use when we're trying to discuss peace and peace building in the real world.
Absolutely. And I think this might be the only time I'll ever say I agree with Trump. It is good that we got to see how this was being constructed because it allows us to see in real time the formation of a peace narrative that when you're dealing with ancient sources, we don't have that in the room moment. And thus it enforces more forcefully why we need to pull these events and these texts apart in that way, because there is no person in the room kind of showing the public like actually how event unfolded. I kind of want to step a little bit back now because having just referenced, the men on top, the people who are dictating these kind of terms of peace and things, what kind of difference might this kind of storytelling have made in the lives of everyday people? You mentioned again that the feedback loop between narrative and reality and ramifications of peace storytelling. If we're looking at others within societies, how does it look different?
Yeah, so, just to stay with the modern analogy for a minute, the negotiations, the concessions, and so on that are decided at the highest political levels, of course, materially affect what happens to every individual on the ground in Ukraine and elsewhere. It affects how much longer people will continue fighting. It affects the financial circumstances in which they live, all sorts of everyday impacts on ordinary people who are caught up in a conflict not of their making. And that's as true in antiquity, of course, as it is in the modern world. So even when we get glimpses like we do in the Ethiopica or in Pliny's Panegyricus of the defeated, usually the focus is on a kind of defeated leader rather than the defeated wider population, the civilian population. Not always, sometimes we get glimpses of them too. But I think what we really need to do is drill down as far as we possibly can into that civilian population. So to take an example of this, in antiquity, there were recurring links between negotiating a peace treaty or conquering another state and either plunder or taxation. In our ancient sources, the consequences, the ramifications of that tend to be articulated at the state level, not at the personal level. But if we think about the personal level literally means some people went hungry. It literally means that some people's farms were completely looted, or their crops were completely destroyed. And therefore, what did they have to do? They starved or they moved elsewhere. They moved in with other families. They tried to find all sorts of means and ways of surviving. If we follow through the implications of that even further, it might have meant that some children lost their siblings. It might have meant that some children, because they were so hungry, did not grow physically or indeed neurologically in ways that would have been ideal. It might have meant that some women ended up having to do very different kinds of work from the work that they, might mean that some women had to end up doing, for instance, sex work. These are modern terms that actually must have been ancient realities as well. If we think through ancient understandings of peace as pacification and securitization, and therefore an ongoing military presence of the oppressor force or the victorious force in a region, then the ramifications of that for civilian people is that there's an ongoing military force present in your day-to-day life, who might or might not stop you from going from one part of the city to the next, who might or might not search you or question you or actually extort a bribe from you on a day-to-day basis. And we know that this is what happens in the modern world. We know that this is people's everyday reality in places that either have a peacekeeping force or have a sort of an oppressor force present, securitizing them. So those are some of the everyday realities that, the association of peace with securitization has ramifications for ordinary people's lives. If there's this normalization of conflict as a default state, then one of the things that it means is that your leaders, your politicians are readier to go to war than they would otherwise be. And therefore that you might be conscripted, that you or your family members might be suddenly extracted from their lives, from your lives, and sent elsewhere, with economic ramifications, with personal ramifications. I've just given you a kind of snapshot of a few of the ways in which the peace imaginaries, the habits of thinking about peace and conflict in antiquity that we can reconstruct from our ancient sources trickled down and had everyday effects on ordinary people, which through a kind of combination of reading against the grain of our ancient sources and drawing on modern case studies, we can start to reconstruct if we want to pay attention to ordinary lives, to civilian lives, and really think about the secondary impacts, not just the primary impacts of conflict and lives in the wake of conflict for years or decades beyond the actual war fighting.
Yeah, absolutely. It is incredibly interesting to imagine the different markets and different social institutions and all the different things that pop up after the conflict has ended, or how they've reconfigured themselves to deal with that emerging market or a change in their demographic. Like suddenly maybe you're depopulated by a lot of soldier-aged men, but then a whole new cohort of soldier-aged men who have nothing to do with you come, like such an interesting thought experiment to push it farther and to see like what can we actually extract from this information. So that sounds really cool. And as well, it takes us to the area of study in classics and antiquity that has for the last several decades become of much more interest and more importance, and that's the study of non-elites and enslaved people and women. And so it allows us to get closer to them.
Yes, absolutely. And if we think about the makeup of our population, the vast majority, the whole of that massive chunk of the iceberg below the surface are those people. And so it's, unless we want a really skewed literally surface level picture of antiquity, then it's absolutely imperative that we do start to dig down and dig deeper. And as you say, there's plenty of work in ancient studies that is exploring this. The history of popular culture in antiquity has been burgeoning. Slave histories as well, women's histories too, driven by all sorts of different trends in scholarship within and beyond classics. I'm also inspired by work in modern peace studies. So a scholar called Oliver Richmond, based at Manchester University, is really interested at the moment in what he calls peace ephemera. His argument, and mine as well, is that people have always yearned for and missed and sought and remade peace. But their efforts are the bits of evidence that tend to drop through the sieve as time passes. So ordinary peace histories are hard to excavate, but they were there and they're worth excavating. Oliver Richmond would argue that the loss or the erasure of ordinary, everyday peace experiences is sometimes accidental, but actually is sometimes deliberate. That it's very much in the interests of the elite to maintain a monopoly on their visions of peace, on, peace as triumph, peace as victory, peace as empowering, and so on, and not to hold on to all the moments of protest, all the graffiti, the art, the riots, speeches, the protests, the riots that actually disputed those top-down visions of peace. So one of the things that we can do as scholars who are trying to excavate more of a popular history, a people's history of ancient peace and peace building, is we're not just actually trying to do better scholarship and fill in a more holistic representative picture. This is actually a political act of scholarship. It's about a resistance to ongoing elite top-down efforts to dominate peace discourses and peace knowledge. So we are addressing a kind of historic epistemic control, addressing the hegemony of dominant discourses and imaginaries. If we say we know that there were protests, we know that people thought about peace differently in different ways, that people created different kinds of peace art, that people had different kinds of peace slogans, they're really hard to excavate. Most of them have disappeared, both for accidental and perhaps non-accidental reasons. But these unarchived pasts, as Elena Isaev would call them, someone who works on ancient and modern migration, offer rich possibilities for us, not only in excavating a fuller picture of ancient peace and peace building, but actually in addressing the dominance of the kinds of peace discourse that we've been talking about already. It is very important politically as well as academically to produce a more inclusive history of ancient peace and peace building by looking as hard as we can for everyday practices, as hard as we can for flickers of protest. And there are all sorts of ways of doing that. It's not easy at all. But I would say that we actually have a responsibility to look for these peace ephemera, to look for the unarchived pasts, and to start archiving them, not only so that we know more, but so that we are surfacing peace knowledge that has long been suppressed or oppressed in our history of peace and peace building.
So that's very interesting. And I hear a bit of a call for a challenge, Alice. You say it's difficult for us to pull these narratives out and to pull these voices and protests and acts of resistance and different histories of peace and put them into the forefront. Can you give us an example of how you might do that, given how challenging it is?
Yeah, so this involves creative methodologies as well as academic rigor, so that what we're doing is we're dealing with the gaps in our sources in an evidence-based way, but we are somehow bringing to life voices that have been erased. So some of the ways in which we could do this are where we take a nugget from an ancient source and we really, really probe it, like Tacitus's Agricola. So in Tacitus's Agricola, he makes the Scottish chieftain, the sort of freedom fighter Calgarcus, critique Roman conquest and indeed Roman peace, right? So Calgarcus is made to say something along the lines of, look, they steal, they pillage, they rape, they make a desert of this place, and they call it peace. And this is a fabricated speech. Tacitus has put it in for drama to give an alternative perspective. It's not necessarily a reflection of any real kind of protest. It's not necessarily a reflection of what any ancient Scottish or British person thought or felt, but it's an opportunity, it's an opening, it's an open door for us to say, well, let's take some modern case studies then. Let's think about the frameworks, the actual realities of Roman imperialism, Roman conquest. Let's gather whatever evidence we can. This might be graffiti on Hadrian's wall, epigraphic evidence from Roman Britain. Let's see what we can find and then think about, what kind of criticism or indeed resistance to Roman methods of pacification are there any traces of, perhaps in Roman changes of practice, Roman adaptations of imperial policy or control? Is there any evidence? And in the absence of a lot of evidence, how can we bring in modern case studies to explore possible and plausible accounts of what it might have been like either not to be able to resist or indeed to resist? What kinds of criticisms and what kinds of resistance might have been possible or plausible? In other words, so that we're following up the cue from Tacitus, as I say, as this open door, as this opportunity, as this invitation almost to say, well, let's look at this from the other side. Let's look at it from the perspective, not of the Roman dominant power, but from others. To give another example, one of my Visualising Peace and War students, Elizabeth Walker, has been doing some research into trends in diplomatic discourse in Greek and Roman worlds, and really pondering the push and pull pressures that triggered slight changes in that diplomatic discourse. So the ways in which, looking at how diplomatic discourse evolved through treaties and through other, the speeches that we hear in ancient history texts and inscriptions and, other kinds of evidence along those lines. And then reading between the lines of some of those changes, the evolution in diplomatic discourse, to think about whether they actually reflect perhaps changing responses to Roman or Greek hegemony, whether they reflect any kind of resistance, perhaps, any kind of protest. Another of my Visualising War and Peace students, Martha Schilliker, has been taking texts like Euripides' Trojan Women and trying to look behind them alongside what we know about women's networks of mutual support in modern conflicts, to think about, well, what could we piece together about this sort of the very informal responses to trauma, very informal responses to sexual violence, displacement, many other impacts of war that women managed to sort of craft. We don't have much direct evidence of female networks of mutual support or help with post-conflict healing, post-conflict recovery, but we have tiny traces in our sources that can help us start looking. And again, in dialogue with modern studies, we could perhaps use inference and think that through in more creative ways. So those are just three examples of how we can take cues in our ancient texts that give us a sort of glimpse, make something slightly visible. So we're not just inventing it, we're not just making up the possibility that there was resistance, the possibility that there were women collectives who banded together in the wake of violence. We're not making any of that up, but we are using creative methods to try and put flesh on the bones of that, drawing on ancient and modern evidence, using inference, and then creatively reconstructing some of those experiences through this mixed methods approach.
In bringing together these modern examples and rooting them in antiquity and rooting them in the past, it feels like you're forging different pathways that we can look at this. And so the Ancient Peace Studies Network, it seems purposefully interdisciplinary. And it seems that there's a lot to be gained by drawing from different creative outlets, different media opportunities and mediums, with researchers from a wide range of fields and perhaps artists and other practitioners to bring into modern peace studies. What can modern peace studies contribute to our study of peace and peace building in antiquity in that case?
It can contribute a huge amount. So it's already the case that people studying ancient peace and peace building have lent into some aspects of modern peace theory. Most notably, Johann Galtung, the father of modern peace theory in some ways. His theories, for example, of the distinction between negative and positive peace being simply the absence of conflict, positive peace being something that is much more sustainable and much more holistic, and very much connected with Galtung's theory of the triangle of violence, where, of course, you've got direct violence, but also you've got structural violence and you've got cultural violence. And if we think only about direct violence, then we only ever think about armed conflict, really. Whereas if we're thinking about structural and cultural violence, we look at peace beyond the peace-war binary. We look at racism, we look at social inequalities, and then we start to look at peace somewhat differently. So some of that work is already happening, but there are lots of other aspects of modern peace studies and modern peace theory which could really inform how we look back with fresh eyes at antiquity. So we could study modern instances of what sometimes gets called the Carthaginian peace, the perpetrator's peace, the victor's peace, belligerent peace building and securitization, modern instances of that as a way to refresh our thinking on the Pax Romana, for instance. We could really dig deep into modern critiques of so-called liberal peace building that assumes that a peaceful society absolutely requires democracy and, a healthy civic society, all good things, but also very Western thinking and quite a one-size-fits-all idealization of peace and peace building. So critiques of liberal peace can help us look at ancient forms of top-down peace building and indeed ancient associations of peace with law and peace with certain forms of political governance. Again, with fresh eyes, really critically. The local turn in modern peace studies prompts us in antiquity to look much more at local contexts and at grassroots and bottom-up kinds of peace building, which our ancient sources don't prompt us or invite us to do. Everyday peace is another dimension of modern peace studies that again gets us asking new questions about what ordinary people in different contexts in antiquity not only did in the everyday in order to maintain a sense of either personal peace or peace, within the community, but what they might have missed when peace was absent. So the Everyday Peace Indicators project, a really fantastic project working in various different parts of the world today, goes to individual communities and says, rather than us telling you what peace looks like, what do you think peace looks like to you? What does peace feel like in your day-to-day life? And it might be being able to keep a pig for an entire season because you're not at threat of being displaced, or it might be feeling safe to stop at traffic lights, or it might be not having playground equipment that doubles up as a bomb shelter. Those are everyday peace indicators that ordinary people in local communities identify as either the indicators of the absence of peace or the presence of peace. And just taking that kind of approach helps us go back and ask different questions about what people in different contexts in antiquity might have missed, looked for, sought, tried to make in the wake of conflict or in the presence of conflict or in the process of peace building. So there really is a huge amount that we can learn from modern peace studies, from modern visual politics as well, the impact that art, photography have on our mindsets and our mentalities. That helps us look again at ancient monumental art, ancient visual culture, as well as narrative textual culture. And feminist, decolonizing approaches to modern peace studies are things that we can feed back into, looking at how sustainable or unsustainable, how connected to justice or not connected to justice, and so on, ancient conceptions of peace were. So really, modern peace studies can enrich the questions that we ask about antiquity by just giving us fresh lenses, prompting new questions. And the idea is not to constantly find parallels between modern peace studies or modern peace experiences and modern peace discourses in antiquity, but just to use modern peace studies as a stimulus for asking new questions about the ancient world.
Absolutely. And to flip that, can ancient peace studies contribute to modern peace studies?
Yes, absolutely, for all sorts of reasons. One reason is that there's a very, very long history of people yearning for, losing, making and remaking peace. It's not a new phenomenon. It's something that people have been doing for as long as there has been war, and therefore pretty much as long as there has been human society. So exploring different approaches to that through time is very valuable. It's an early chapter in human history, an early chapter in human evolution almost. But I think above all, what modern peace studies can perhaps gain from a fresh approach to ancient peace studies is the emphasis that we want to put on studying discourses of peace and peace imaginaries. By looking at ancient discourses of peace and really interrogating why some became dominant and why some didn't, and what impacts those dominant narratives had on centuries of peace building and centuries of conflict, we can really draw out some fascinating lessons that are very relevant for today for understanding the role that discourse storytelling has in the present day. In modern peace and conflict studies, there is a lot of attention paid to visual narratives, to storytelling. But I think that attention, that focus can be really sharpened by a deep history of ancient peace imaginaries and historic discourses of peace and their impacts over time and their repercussions beyond antiquity as well. So that for me, I think, would be one of the biggest things that a new study of ancient peace can contribute to modern peace studies.
So there are so many interesting pathways and so many interesting elements that your project has taken on. And you've given us a lot of really juicy pieces of evidence from antiquity and so many elements of things you will be working on with this project and areas that it can potentially encompass and ways to inspire new researchers and academics to get involved in this. Now, as well as publication plans, though, which you've alluded to, you already have quite a bit of outreach underway. And that's, for me, particularly interesting. I love public engagement, public outreach. Particularly with NMT Automatics, you've been collaboratively working on and with professional theater engagement. And can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been working with the theatre company NMT Automatics for a while now, and we've collaborated in the past on a play about conflict, about war, ancient war and the war in Afghanistan, a play called Tempus Fugit. But we've got a new project underway now that's been inspired by this new interest in ancient and modern peace studies. The working title at the moment is Reina, and it's a play that is going to be drawing on ancient myth to explore modern understandings of peace and peace building and finding peace in the wake of conflict in particular. So the play is going to be set in Crete in World War II. And it's going to uncover a little known story about World War II, about the history of the Jewish community in Crete during World War II. There was a Jewish community who in 1942 were rounded up by the Germans, by the Nazis, onto a ship ready to be taken actually to concentration camps in Germany. But that ship was torpedoed en route and everyone went down with it. And as a result of that episode in Crete's history, the Jewish community was decimated in Crete. There is very little of a Jewish community left. So one of the things that the play is going to do is not only explore that bit of World War II history, but actually bring it back to life in the 21st century. But as part of that, the central character in this play is a little girl called Reina, a member of the Jewish community in Crete at the time, whose family are all rounded up onto the boat, but she wasn't at home at the time that the German soldiers came calling, and she's taken in by a Cretan fisherman and looked after. In the play, while she's hiding from the German soldiers, the story is that she falls down whole in the roots of a tree and gets into the Cretan labyrinth, the labyrinth of Knossos, the labyrinth at the Minotaur inhabited, and she falls into Greek myth. And through the Greek myth, then, the Minotaur is going to manifest as trauma, as vengeance, as the othering of enemies, as appeasement. The Minotaur is going to take on a number of characteristics of conflict. And the idea is that on Raina's sort of labyrinthine journey, as I say, she'll not only encounter a lot of ancient Greek stories that help illuminate ancient ideas of peace and peace building, but she'll actually explore approaches to finding peace and doing personal peace building that have a lot to teach us today. So it's a play that reflects on different discourses of peace and conflict, but also is designed to, I suppose, enhance and explore peace literacy in the modern world. So it's not just a reflection, but it's an exploration and the role that story sharing can play in building peace in the wake of conflict.
Awesome. That sounds fabulous. So for listeners as well, if you're interested in the earlier episodes, we have NMT Automatics founders, Jenny Dunn and Jonathan Young, having participated in discussions with Alice about their work and projects as well. So I do really encourage you to go to the back catalog and have a listen to those interviews as well. That's brilliant, Alice. You've taken us on such a delightful journey and with so much meat on the bones already and getting us ready for things to come and whetting our appetite for where this can go and what your research is going to be jumping into. I guess if we can drill it down, in a nutshell, what do you hope the Ancient Peace Studies Network will contribute both to ancient and modern peace studies and perhaps military studies and modern peace literacy as it gets underway?
Yeah, so I suppose change, really. A shaking up of old habits of studying war and peace in antiquity and fresh perspectives both on antiquity and on modern peace studies through that ancient lens. And of course, one of our objectives, one of our goals is absolutely to look beyond academia as well. I think, we've talked already about the often militarizing impact which antiquity has in our modern world through popular culture. So there are lots of ways in which if we have a new people's history of ancient peace and peace building, we can actually do innovative new things through popular culture, through, for instance, gaming, peace gaming via antiquity, let's say, where we're actually contributing to modern peace literacy and pushing back against militarization in the modern world as well. New publications, new approach to ancient peace and war studies, new lenses for modern peace and conflict studies, and then hopefully these ripple effects out into peace literacy in the 21st century through a range of public engagement activities.
That is an excellent answer, and I really appreciate how much care you put into this and how much detail you've given listeners. We have a lot to look forward to and a lot to be hopeful for. So thank you so much, Alice. This has been a wonderful discussion.
Thank you, and thanks so much for being willing to host.
Always my pleasure. And also thank you to you, our listeners, for joining us again. We have more episodes coming up over the spring as we continue to explore different visualizations of both war and peace in different contexts. So please keep tuning in. If you would like to support the project, please do share our podcast with others in your networks. If you would like to join the conversation further, you can follow us on social media. Just search for Visualizing Peace or get in touch by emailing directly at vispeace@st-andrews.ac.uk. The theme music was composed by Jonathan Young, and the show was mixed by me, Zofia Guertin. Thanks for listening.